This is CX of M Radio, the voice of customer experience professionals.
Welcome to the Delighted Customers Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Slayton, and I'm so glad you're here. I empower leaders to turn indifferent customers into loyal fans. I talk to guests with a wide range of expertise who share meaningful insights and wisdom. We give you practical tips and proven frameworks and share ways to help you delight your customers. My guest on today's show is Richard Owen, and Richard has a singular focus that is to deliver financial value through customers. He was the CEO of Satmetrix. If you remember them, he worked closely with Fred Reichheld and Rob Markey to launch Net Promoter System. And now he's innovating again through his new company, OCX Cognition. He's the CEO, and he promises to change the game when it comes to customer experience management. And in today's show, we talk about the difference between AI, machine learning, and neurolinguistic programming, how data can help companies improve their customer experience through the use of AI, and the evolution of customer research and why AI is a game changer and why CX practitioners shouldn't be afraid of it at all. Let's dive right in. Well, I am so excited to have my guest, Richard Owen from OCX Cognition, on the show today. Richard is one of the best-known thought leaders in the customer experience industry. And he was the CEO of Satmetrix. Those of you who've been in the industry a while are familiar with that name. His team led the development of the Net Promoter Score methodology along with Fred Reichheld, which created the most widely used approach to measuring customer experience in the world. And then, together with Dr. Laura Brooks, he co-authored Answering the Ultimate Question, which quickly became the how-to guide for NPS practitioners. And it was those of us back then when it came out were thirsty for sources of information on how to apply the knowledge that came out of the earlier writings. So I would add the how-to guide for NPS practitioners. I would add the how-to guide for CX practitioners in general, because it really extended beyond just NPS. So with that, let me introduce my guest, Richard. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks very much especially for the generous introduction.
Yes. And so I'm so excited to talk to you and honored. We all came to the world of customer experience management from different paths. What was your, I shared a little bit of your background, but what was your path?
So not through the customer experience industry, but through line management. So back in the 1990s, I was a general manager with Dell Computer Corporation. And at one point, I was running one of Dell's biggest businesses in Asia out of Tokyo. And we'd always had this theory at Dell that what really differentiated the company at the end of the day was customer experience. And the company, which was odd for a manufacturer, but if you're selling a product that's, let's face it, fairly generic, you have to have something that was differential. And Dell was very committed to this idea. And they put in place a series of executive compensation variables that attempted to sort of capture the essence of what customer experience meant to Dell. And it was 6 core metrics, and it ranged from logistics performance to early life quality to technical support. And everybody, including myself, above a certain level in the company was bonused on this. So we all had drummed into us the idea that the customer experience was highly quantifiable, was important, was a differentiation. And a lot of what I dealt with running a business in Japan was the unique quirks of life in Japan and what customer experience meant to the Japanese, which was in many instances quite different than to the Americans. So I became very interested in it then. And then in 2000, I was running a software company in the mobile enterprise space. We'd just taken that public. And we decided that customer experience was one of the true potential differentiators in software. And we were looking at companies that were really pushing the envelope on that. And one of them was Siebel systems. And ironically, Satmetrix was really accelerated by a decision by Siebel Systems, not just to buy the product, but also for Tom Siebel to invest in the company and Siebel to invest in the company. So Satmetrix, when I joined, was actually in some ways a product of that initiative at Siebel. So I'd really got interested in this idea of quantification and measurement from a line manager perspective, not from a sort of CX analyst or researcher perspective. And I've kind of kept that point of view ever since. I always start with, my job number one is I'm a general manager. I'm running businesses. My second job is what's the best practice for CX within those businesses?
Yeah. And so for CX leaders, most CX leaders, I'm fairly confident, did not come from the world of artificial intelligence. So we're gonna spend some time exploring what OCX Cognition does, and in this world of how we can apply artificial intelligence to help customer experience management wherever we're doing that from. But before we do, not everybody in the audience is in the CX space. We could have people listening who are, you mentioned general managers who could be, leading banks, leading insurance companies, leading wealth management companies, and anything in between. And so my question to you is, you wrote this second book. So I'll lay it out. So Net Promoter Score, if you're not familiar with it, is probably still the most popular loyalty metric, customer loyalty metric, and way to measure the loyalty of customers. It's most commonly used, in some cases reported at the board level. Some companies report it in their earnings reports and so forth. And it simply is the ultimate question. That's the name of the first book. The ultimate question, which is, how likely are you to recommend a friend or colleague to whatever your business is? And then the follow-up question, of course, is, what was the reason for your score? Right. And so the original book was written, and then I think there was a 2.0 book. But then you wrote Answering the Ultimate Question, I guess more of an application. What white space existed for you to write that book?
Well, I think that let's go back to the start of what made Net Promoter, I think, an interesting idea. And I think that when you think about it, Net Promoter Score is predominantly a mechanism for sub-segmenting customers into three groups. And, we call those three groups promoters, passives, and detractors. But to all intents and purposes, they're simply three groups that have radically different economic performance. The first group, promoters, tends to generate disproportionate profits, tends to contribute very directly to future growth, often through word of mouth, but also through cross-sell, upsell a product. The second group that we've sort of named passives don't typically generate as much profit, don't typically have as much growth potential, and typically will switch vendors if presented with a more attractive offer. They're very unsticky. And then this third group, detractors, usually have a negative lifetime value for the company. In fact, they're a group of customers that probably cost you more to serve than you make in profit if you can get your head around the math. So the insight from NPS was that if we can segment customers cleanly into these three groups, then companies that have a lot more of group one are clearly in better health than companies have a lot of group three. Now, the mechanism at the time was surveying. It just so happened that there was a great way to do this by asking customers through surveys. But I want people to separate the metric, which is useful, from survey mechanisms, which is just one tool for gathering the metric. The reason so many executives glommed onto NPS as a metric was really two things. The first was there was extremely good empirical data work done by Dr. Laura Brooks and Fred Reichheld to demonstrate linkage between performance around NPS and industry level performance, largely B2C data, largely from the last part of the 1990s, early 2000s, but across multiple industries, there was a good linkage. So executives could say, any metric I want, I need to have confidence has some economic corresponding positive outcome. And that was what NPS gave them. The second thing was it was a very simple concept to communicate. if I'm going to create accountability and I'm going to tell 10,000 employees around this idea that we're going to measure, then what I can't do is say, and the way we're going to measure it is an index of 10 different questions weighted in a specific formula, and it's going to generate a scale of 0 to 100, and you're going to get your bonus plan paid on it. And people are just going to say, okay, that's roulette. At the end of the year, I'll see what comes out of it. Whereas describing customers as these three groups, promoted, passive, detractors, everyone could get their head around it. So I think those two things made it very popular. But beyond that, nobody really knew what it meant to implement it. And even within the old survey universe that we used to exist within, there were a lot of questions about how to implement it. Well, do you implement it once a year, twice a year? Do you ask that question at the end of a transactional event, like a contact center call? The answer, by the way, is no, never. Do you measure it on across the entire customer base as a census? How do you handle sampling? And so a lot of the practical things that people were running into, I just don't think there were well-developed answers for. And so what we set out to do was create a body of knowledge as to what best practice was, which we did with the book. And then we created the certification product. And the certification product was, massively successful. So it was a joint venture with Fred when it was created. And it went on to about 6,000 companies got involved in certifying people as Net Promoter NPS professionals, by far and away the biggest training program of its kind, by a country mile, and still lives on, and still companies continue to get certified, translated into Japanese, rolled out around the world. And it's basically the same body of knowledge, but markets 2008 body of knowledge. And I'd say that today it is long in the tooth in some very important ways that we need to probably address, and it's part of the reason OCX Cognition exists, is to sort of bring the universe that we created in 2008 up to 2022.
Yeah. So I heard a few things. One is it worked at the time because there was really good empirical data, although that data existed mostly in the B2C space. And I do want to follow up on that conversation. It's also a little bit dated now. I wanted to piggyback. And then secondly, for its simplicity, that people get their head around it. I remember the story of Rob Markey at Bain talking about they had developed a pretty sophisticated way to measure, but that was the problem. It was so sophisticated, nobody understood, what was in the recipe. And that raises all sorts of questions for credibility and authority. And if you're tying it to my paycheck, then we have a trust issue, right? Right.
Well,
so,
and you have to remember back then, there were a lot of sort of closed box metrics. You had companies, whose business was going into large organizations saying, we'll design the perfect metric for you, and it'll be proprietary, it'll be a black box, which was a great business, because once you'd started doing that, black box was a great way to go. I mean, look, JD Powers built their entire business off black box metrics. And I think that's a great business, but it's a lousy metric. And so I think that simplicity does matter. And when I always say to people who are critical of NPS, they're usually critical more about the technique or the surveying than they are about the actual metric, which is, let's say, I think not without some justification. But they say if you're going to come up with something better, then it has to be a lot better to justify the increase in complexity. If you're going to tell me you've invented this whiz-bang, 10-point question, 10-question model, or 10 data point model that's way better than NPS at predicting growth, then my answer is to you, okay, it's got to be massively better at predicting growth for me to deal with the additional complexity. And usually people fail that test. It just doesn't usually come out that way.
Yeah. Well said. And I'm one of those people way back, a decade ago, that got certified in the Satmetrix program and the NPS certification. So just to add some credibility to it. So I was also one, as a segue into this whole AI piece. I was also one who lived quarter in and quarter out using, like many people would be using a platform via voice of the customer platform to run surveys, to analyze the feedback from surveys, to create insights, to make recommendations to leadership, go through that whole cycle. Obviously, having a closed feedback loop when we get customers who are, unhappy, or there's opportunities that arise. So going through that, looking at the data, straining to figure out what stories to tell from that data. And because, quite often what you're measuring doesn't change a whole lot. So, leadership is like, okay, NPS went down 4 points, NPS went up 4 points. So what's the story? So you've often got to dig, but then there's this whole other thing that I know we're going to be talking about here, which is we used to brag about the fact that we got a 13% response rate. And it wasn't as high for our commercial clients. So I want to just ask you a question relative to those two things, because I know at 13%, we were actually higher than I was in banking. So a lot of our banks in the same mid-sized bank range, ended up being a $13 billion bank. So, but anywhere from 7 to 10 billion, 13 billion, $15 billion, 13% response rate was actually pretty good, as like one in more than 8 customers who got a survey responded. Little bit less on the commercial side. So, that does beg I'll leave that for you. I'll leave that the problem with the 13%, as we began to stop pounding our chests about how proud we were about the 13% and used it as a proxy for the other 87. The other piece is the commercial side, which was really, and this is true, I think I know it is for insurance, maybe not so much for wealth management, but the other piece, the commercial business, was really where the bread and butter was made. That is really where the lion's share of the profits that contributed to the bottom line came from. And yet we really didn't have great data, because number one, the response rate was lower, but also we didn't have a confidence level about who was responding to the survey. Right. From that business, and you have multiple users. So I want you to talk about, how OCX and artificial intelligence can be used to help CX practitioners. And what are we talking about? Are we talking about a sea change from 1990 and 2003? Is it that much different?
Yeah, so I think it is a sea change, but let's start with a few sort of definitional ideas here. So AI is such a catchy buzzword. We talk to our devices in the home, and Alexa, which is an AI device, and we say that's it, right? And so I think that it's there are a lot of branches of artificial intelligence. The most commonly applied artificial intelligence tool over the last 20 years has probably been natural language processing, which is a branch of AI. And so a lot of people say AI and they think NLP. Machine learning is a different branch of AI. And we're mainly focused on machine learning. And so to be specific, that is the technology we're deploying. And machine learning, has within itself, a whole series of subsegments, supervised learning, et cetera. But what I think people need to understand about this is that in some ways, we're really just talking about algorithms. We're just talking about math. And what's changed over the last 20 years is that there's a lot more data, and there's a lot more processing power, and there's a lot more prepackaged algorithmic tools that enable us to build applications that can process this data and gain insights from this data in ways that just weren't available to us going back even 10 years ago. And so this step function in data and processing power has come together, and that creates opportunity. Now, why does any of this matter for the CX space? So if you roll back really far back in time, CX emerged out of research techniques that were built in the sort of 1960s with people walking around in clipboards and asking people questions. And then, of course, sampling mathematics said, if I get what I think is a representative sample, I can extrapolate. So I get 5% of people to tell me something. And if I think it's a reasonably representative sample, first class in statistics you take, then you go, okay, I can extrapolate for the rest of the group. And that is generally a consumer research technique because it assumes homogeneity, that basically that sample is highly representative of the rest of the group. By the way, in B2B, that's almost never the case. So immediately this technique is sort of fundamentally flawed. We just didn't have anything better. Over the next 20, 30 years, what technology did was essentially it concreted that cowpath. It took the clipboard and it made it digital. So we moved to doing telephone surveys in the 80s. And in fact, one of my first jobs when I was working for Regis McKenna years and years ago was picking up the phone and doing data collection by phone. So we moved from clipboards in the streets to phone. Then we moved to email. And in fact, when NPS first came out, there were a lot of companies saying, email data collection, that's technologically too sophisticated for us. We're still using banks of phone people to collect data. And so people started moving to email, and email did two things. One, it basically automated the clipboard. Most surveys today are basically an automated clipboard. Somebody gets an email, which is an invitation to a web page. The web page is the clipboard. They fill in the clipboard virtually, and the data just gets written into a database. And essentially, we've fully automated the clipboard. It's a brilliant automation. But the other thing that's happened as we've sort of gone as far as we can get with that technology set is we've saturated the market with survey, because if the cost of surveying drops and the marginal cost essentially today is zero, you can send 1 million surveys out at a marginal cost of essentially zero. The inevitable effect is you get a huge increase in the number of surveys. And the tragedy of the commons, which is one of these favorite things economists like to talk about, says an overused resource, an abundantly free resource, will be overused. And the resource we're overusing is customers' time. We assume that customers have an appetite to spend more and more time answering surveys. Of course, they don't. So the fact is now, if I went on a business trip 20 years ago, I might have had one survey. Now I'll probably get 10. Everybody from the taxi company or more likely Uber, through the airline, through the hotel, through the restaurants, are all asking me for feedback. My time allocation to give that feedback hasn't grown. In fact, it's shrunk. So I'm going to respond less. And so response rates are declining. Survey volumes are increasing. And this is not an inevitable path to zero, right? It doesn't take a genius to figure out that sooner or later, the response rates are going to go to essentially de minimis. So in B2B, we can't really use the data well anyway. In B2C, the response rates are declining. So surveying as an intrusive mechanism has kind of run its course. And you can see the limitations in data quality. So we obviously at Satmetrix, we had done literally 1,000 enterprise implementations of survey-based platforms. So we've done millions of surveys. And we could see this in the data very clearly. And it was also indicating that the bias that was getting introduced into the respondent base was killing the accuracy of the data as well. So everything was starting to collapse around survey-based CX programs. So you need to find a substitute. And the key insight that we'd observed in patterns of customer behavior was that whether or not a customer was a promoter, passive, or detractor was entirely predictable. Now, I don't mean a predictable 100%, but I mean predictable to a reasonable level of accuracy. Let me boil it down to a very simple idea. Let's say I'm back in my old days at Dell Computer, and a customer orders a personal computer, and I tell them it'll be with them in 3 days. And it shows up 10 days after they place the order. Well, we'd all say, okay, that customer is less likely to be a promoter because of that event. So the question we're trying to answer is really two things. Number one, how important is shipping relative to all the other things around the computer? When they open up the box and they love the computer, is all things forgiven, or is that shipping experience going to be important? And then what represents good? If it is 8 days late acceptable, or is 24 hours late unacceptable? If we can quantify those things, then we can adjust the probability that customer's a promoter. So we could say, going into this, we had a probability of the customer being promoted of, I don't know, 70%. After this, it drops to 30%, and the probability of them being passive goes up to 80%. So we can quantify the probability the customer is one thing or another if we understand what customers value and how much they value it. And so what we've done in building a machine learning platform is we've codified that process into a series of variables that look at all the aspects of the customer journey and essentially assign them very specific types of, you could think of it as weighting. That's not technically what happens in machine learning, but it's a nice way of thinking about it. Weights of importance, weights of relative impact, performance criteria. And then the machine comes out at the end of it and says, I've looked at how you treated this customer, and I'll assign a probability they're a promoter. So what does that change? Well, it means that I don't need a survey response from that customer to come up with an extremely good prediction as to whether they're promoter, passive, or detractor. It also means that I can readjust my prediction every time the customer does something, encounters us with tech support, buys another product. So I can get this continuous massive data set. So it's about 100 times bigger in terms of data set than your traditional relationship survey model. And it covers every single customer, every single account, and it covers it continuously. And essentially, this solves the data problem. Now, I'm not here to tell people or your listeners that this is the only way to solve the data problem. I'm sure other people have very inventive ideas. But what I will say with complete certainty is surveys are not going to be the data source you're going to be dependent on 5 years from now, or you're not going to have a program. And some approach to prediction or substitute for surveys is going to become the dominant technology set. And we think machine learning is very attractive. It works very well. And it's extremely practical. And I'll say one final thing on the topic of B2B. One of the big benefits for applying this to B2B is you predict the behavior of the account, not the individual, which has always been a problem for B2B companies. Because at the end of the day, the account behavior is what ultimately matters. It's whether the account renews, purchases more, leaves. And individuals will come and go. And there's always this question, you have the right individuals, of which we could talk a lot more. But so if you predict accounts, you end up in a much better place. But I think ML is just a different computer technology when it comes down to it. It's not scary. It's not a black box. And you don't have to understand exactly how it works. If you're capable of running a CX program today, you understand key drivers, you understand how data gets organized for CX, you're very capable of adopting this new technology. I think that the big shift, Mark, is from people who first and foremost think of themselves as survey authors. For them, this is not really the universe we're moving into. We're all becoming data people. We're not survey people.
Yeah, well, thanks for laying that out. I was able to follow it. So thank you. But I wanted to talk about the other aspects of the customer experience management and how this fits in. So you're not saying the other elements of what a CX practitioner needs to do, which involves then get the data, understanding how the journey functions, tying it to financials, which is going to be important. What's the financial, and maybe this is built into the AI, like what is the value of a particular client? And let me stop there and let you respond to that.
But we're just dealing with much better data. So I don't think you take away from people the work they need to do around journey design. I think it's important. Around linkage analysis, I think that's still useful. The thing is, to use an old cliche, everything is dialed to 11. And I think that you're just getting a vastly larger data set and a much accurate data set to play with. After identifying pattern, we are pointing to operational improvements in the business. We are persuading, we are distributing data around the company. Those things don't change. It's just the data set that changes.
Excellent. And so this is fascinating. And I think what you've helped us to do was to demystify it a little bit, because I think it's scary for people, like I said, who aren't familiar with it. So is there anything along those lines that you'd like to add, just in terms of saying, why we shouldn't be afraid of it, and what kind of comfort level should you expect?
And how does that domain expertise manifest itself? Well, people understand the very nature of CX measurement. They understand how data gets organized along customer journeys. They understand the types of information that the company is going to want to communicate, how to persuade management teams. I would argue a typical CX professional has 90% of the skills required to do this. And then on the data technology side, I think that is honestly not frightening at all. I think if people are frightening you with it, then I think they're trying to confuse you.
Well, excellent. Richard, this has been a fascinating discussion. I am excited for what you're doing, and I am excited that the information, the data can only help improve experiences for our customers, and with a much more likelihood of accuracy and success. And that's exciting for anyone who cares deeply, because I believe, and I don't know how you feel about it, but I believe when we deliver an outstanding customer experience, we can change a trajectory of someone's day, and by doing so can make the world a better place.
I think I'll say the same thing I said 20 years ago when people were arguing that, the telephone's a better method for collecting data. It's like, there's always going to be some people who are pushing forward and pushing the boundary and want to try new things and are ambitious. And those are the people we're looking for to join us on the journey at the end of the day. We love the early adopters. We like the people who have the courage and cut out new ground, as they did with NPS 20 years ago. And so I hope they take some motivation or some excitement from this, because that's who's become our customer base and, frankly, our employee base. So it's great to see people embarking on a new adventure around CX.
Yes. Well, thank you. So many gems here, so much learning that I appreciate you teaching. And hey, if people want to get a hold of you and maybe start a conversation around this, what would be the best way?
So, richard.owen@ocxcognition.com. I'm there on LinkedIn as well. Just feel free to connect.
Okay. Richard, thank you so much for being on the show.
You're welcome. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for listening to the Delighted Customers podcast. I'd like to ask you a favor. If you have enjoyed this episode or any of my other ones, hit subscribe or follow. I've got a lot of other great guests that are coming up and a lot of other great content, and I don't want you to miss anything. You can find any links or references on the show in the show notes, and you can find those on my website at empoweredcx.com.
Thanks for joining us for this session of CX of M Radio. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit cxofm.org for more resources.